Ukraine deliberately lured Russian forces into the Sumy region by creating the illusion of weak defenses. Once Russian troops advanced, Ukraine closed the trap, cutting supply lines and targeting them with artillery, drones, and ambushes. The terrain was turned into a death zone, leaving Russian units exposed, undersupplied, and heavily damaged. Ukraine's strategy showed how intelligence, planning, and precision can defeat a larger force. The result was massive Russian losses in men and equipment, while Ukraine strengthened its reputation for resilience and tactical brilliance. Hello everyone, welcome back to the World Conflict Monitor channel. Please subscribe to my channel. The story we are exploring today is one of deception, entrapment, and brutal modern warfare. Ukraine has managed to lure Russian forces into the region of Sumy, drawing them into what many analysts describe as a carefully constructed death zone. This is not just another clash on the battlefield, it is a layered campaign that reveals Ukraine's growing confidence, Russia's desperate tactics, and the high price of every step taken in this brutal war. To begin with a short summary of the story, Ukraine deliberately created conditions that tempted Russian units to push deeper into the Sumy axis. Once Russia committed itself, Ukrainian forces locked down the geography, cut supply lines, and deployed artillery, drones, and precision-guided weapons to turn the area into a trap. For Russia, the region that appeared to offer tactical opportunities quickly became a killing ground. For Ukraine, it was a demonstration of smart defense transformed into offense, revealing how weaker forces can use terrain, timing, and modern tools to offset the numerical advantage of a larger army. From the exterior view, Sumy's landscape played the central role. It is a border region, close enough to Russia for supply lines but also filled with forests, fields, rivers, and urban clusters that can be weaponized by defenders. Ukraine studied this terrain with painstaking detail. Villages became fortified nodes, bridges were either rigged for demolition or left intact as bait, and open fields were calibrated for artillery range. The exterior impression of Sumy may seem like a quiet agricultural zone, but in military terms, it was reshaped into a labyrinth of traps. Russian armored columns entering the area were not just facing soldiers but a battlefield engineered to break momentum, scatter formations, and expose vulnerabilities. From the interior perspective, Ukraine's planning was far more subtle. Inside command centers and secure bunkers, war planners calculated every movement. Communication was streamlined so local commanders could shift tactics within minutes. The interior strategy was simple but deadly. Let Russia believe there was a soft gap to exploit, then shut the door once they entered. Ukrainian intelligence worked with precision, monitoring Russian troop concentrations, tracking vehicle columns through satellite feeds, and using human sources across the border. The interior element of this operation was brief in execution but devastating in effect, because the trap required only one decisive closure to turn movement into massacre. The performance of this strategy was brutal in its efficiency. Once Russian forces pushed into Sumy's corridors, Ukraine unleashed layered firepower. Artillery systems such as HIMARS and domestically adapted rocket launchers hammered staging areas. Precision drones hunted down command vehicles and logistics trucks. Infantry armed with Western-supplied anti-tank systems set up ambushes along narrow approaches. Performance was measured not in speed but in control. Ukraine dictated the tempo, slowing Russian momentum until frustration set in. Russia's performance, by contrast, collapsed under pressure. Tanks became stuck in kill zones, convoys were torn apart, and communication between units faltered. What should have been a show of Russian strength became a chaotic display of weakness, with soldiers trapped between advancing orders and retreating survival instincts. Safety features in this context may sound unusual, but for Ukraine, preserving its own forces while maximizing enemy losses was crucial. Safety meant evacuating civilians in advance where possible, building underground shelters in Sumy towns, and creating fallback corridors for Ukrainian units. Drone surveillance acted as a safety net, ensuring no surprise flanking could occur. Minefields were designed not just to stop Russian armor but to protect Ukrainian infantry by channeling the fight into predictable lines. For Russia, safety features were virtually non-existent. Units advanced into terrain without securing flanks, commanders ignored warnings, and air defense coverage was stretched thin. The contrast highlighted how one side prioritized survivability, while the other exposed its men to slaughter. The unique selling points of this campaign were psychological and symbolic. Ukraine proved it could not only defend but also manipulate. By luring Russian forces into Sumy, Kyiv showed allies that it could wage offensive defense, a rare skill in modern conflict. The unique aspect was turning weakness into strength. Ukraine lacked the manpower to launch massive assaults, but it weaponized terrain and patience to trap larger numbers. Another unique element was the blending of modern and traditional warfare. High-tech drones worked alongside age-old tactics like scorched earth withdrawals, ambushes, and feigned retreats. For Russia, the Sumy disaster became a selling point of failure, evidence that even after years of fighting, it remained vulnerable to deception. When speaking of price, the cost was staggering. For Russia, the price was measured in blood and broken machinery. Entire battalions lost equipment worth millions of dollars. Supply trucks carrying ammunition and food were destroyed, leaving frontline soldiers hungry, undersupplied, and demoralized. The human cost was devastating, with hundreds of soldiers either killed, captured, or cut off from retreat. For Ukraine, the price was also real. Setting up such traps required months of preparation, the sacrifice of some villages, and the displacement of civilians. But compared to Russia's losses, Ukraine's price was calculated and sustainable. The balance sheet of Sumy leaned heavily against Moscow. In conclusion, Ukraine's Sumy operation was not just a battle but a statement. It showed the world that this war is no longer about brute force alone, it is about intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to turn geography into a weapon. Ukraine lured Russia into a death zone not because it had overwhelming power but because it had overwhelming patience and precision. Russia's failure in Sumy adds another chapter to its long list of military miscalculations, while Ukraine emerges stronger in spirit and credibility. For the global audience, this is a reminder that wars are not won merely by the size of armies, but by the sharpness of minds directing them. And so, as we watch events continue to unfold, Sumy stands as both a graveyard of Russian ambition and a monument to Ukrainian resilience. The exterior battlefield speaks of destruction, the interior planning speaks of brilliance, the performance speaks of control, the safety features speak of foresight, the unique selling points speak of ingenuity, the price speaks of sacrifice, and the conclusion speaks of endurance. Ukraine has written another chapter in modern warfare, and Sumy may well be remembered as the death zone where Russia's illusions met Ukraine's reality.